This particular sentence structure can be a little bit tricky, but actually, even though it may look wrong or maybe sound wrong, choice A, no change, is actually correct. And in a second, we'll go through why A is correct, what's going on with that original sentence. But let's first look at B, C, and D, because each of them has something very specifically wrong with it. And if we could see those 4 incorrect choices and understand why they're wrong, we might be able to narrow it down to A, even if we're not completely comfortable with it. So with B, what do we have? Margaret pressed on with the new marketing strategy. She was encouraged by the feedback from her audience. This is a comma splice. I talk about these all the time because they're super common on both SAT and ACT English/grammar. So comma splice is when you have 2 complete sentences separated with just a comma. When you're doing questions like this, where you're combining together sentences or clauses or phrases, you always want to be on the lookout for this one because it comes up so often. So this first sentence is a sentence. Margaret pressed on with the new marketing strategy, period. That could be a complete sentence. And then in B, she was encouraged by the feedback from her audience, also would be a complete sentence. And we can't just use a comma to separate 2 complete sentences. That's no good, no matter how good or smooth or it sounds or it flows. It doesn't matter. You have to be able to recognize that that's always wrong and get rid of it. Second choice, we use a semicolon to separate these 2, and that's the only change we make. And the rule with semicolons is you got to make sure you have a complete sentence before and after that semicolon. It's almost like a semicolon splice is legal where a comma splice isn't. So we've already established that the sentence before the semicolon is complete. What about the one after? So we have, after the semicolon, encouraged by the feedback from her audience. This is not a complete sentence. In fact, this, as written, is a fragment because we're missing a subject for this sentence. If we had something like choice B with a semicolon, that would be acceptable because we'd have 2 complete sentences separated with a semicolon. That's fine. So because we don't have that, the second part of the sentence is not complete, the whole choice is gone. How about D? Margaret pressed on with the new marketing strategy, which is what encouraged by the feedback from her audience. So there's a few things going on here. First, even if the grammatical form of this were correct, I still see this as wordy. If you compare it to the other choices, it's not very elegant, it's not very concise, and it's not very precise. Certainly the which, I suppose, is referring to the strategy, but it's still a little bit ambiguous as to what that which should be referring to. Probably should be referring to something like the success of the strategy is what encouraged her, or something. In any event, it's not clear what's, well, really, maybe it actually should be referring to the feedback. I don't know. This is the problem with the which. The bigger issue, though, is when we, as we might have heard when we read this, this form doesn't work with how the sentence then follows up, which is what encouraged by the feedback. That doesn't make sense. If it said, which is what encouraged her through the feedback, I mean, that's even terrible. So the whole format of this, the whole structure of this, given what follows the sentence, doesn't work. So there's a lot of problems with D. It's definitely not an improvement over the original. So what's going on with the original? What's going on with choice A? This is an example of a participial phrase. A participial phrase that's at the end of a sentence. Very often you will see these at the beginning of sentences, and they can have their own issues when they're there related to what's called dangling or misplaced modifiers. But when they're at the beginning of sentences, they're much less weird, whereas when they're at the end, they're a little bit odd. At least they may seem on a quick read to be odd, but it's totally fine to have a participial phrase like this at the end of a sentence. Participial phrases, I have videos about this in both the SAT writing and ACT English courses, so check those out if you want more information. But participials are basically words that look like verbs, but they're not quite verbs. They're verbs that end in ing or ed if you're looking at the past version of the participle. And there are other versions of participles, but we'll just keep it simple for now. So participles are words that end in ing or ed, and they start off these what are called participial phrases, which basically describe the action of some noun in the sentence. In this case, it's describing how Margaret is encouraged. So one way to check if this participial phrase works at the end of the sentence is, in your mind, move it to the beginning. And if it works at the beginning of the sentence, it also works at the end. So if the sentence said, encouraged by the feedback from her audience, comma, Margaret pressed on with the new marketing strategy, that's totally fine, right? No problems at all with that. So because it works at the beginning, it can work at the end. So we're actually okay with a choice like A. It is not a fragment. It's not a comma splice because this is not a complete sentence. You can attach a phrase to the end of the sentence with just a comma. Totally legit. So that leaves us with no change. To learn more about Reason Prep's SAT, SAT subject test, and ACT video courses, go to reasonprep.com/enroll, and you can find the link in the description below the video.